seems like forever as I say it's 5 minutes. We got to figure this one out, right? Okay, let's see. They had on cassette. Maybe that'll do it. Let me put the pause. There we go. Oh, I figured it out. Okay, now we're off and running. Are you ready? This is Mae Brussell. It is program number 572. It is November 22nd, 1982, the 19th anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy. I forgot to put on the disclaimer, too, and I'll say that now. Anything that I say on this station, on the cassettes, or on the air, I'm totally responsible for. The station has no responsibility for the material that I have going out now. I'm not going to speak specifically about John Kennedy tonight because there's other news that's much more important in my mind that goes back to the Kennedy assassination for sure. But I prefer to use this news at this time and share with you some of the other information that I'm working on. And we'll get back to the specifics of who killed John Kennedy on another program. I'll do 1 hour on that when I really feel up to it. But tonight I want to get to these other matters. One thing I did want to say is that for 11 years I was on another station that was privately owned and then came to this station in July. And I didn't understand the financial trouble that this station was having. It wasn't clear to us, and there was a notice in our boxes last week that the station may close, that they put up a large antenna. It's probably the largest in the area, reaches more people, but the expenses with Pacific Gas, Electric, the operating expenses have been tremendous to keep the high towers going to reach as many people. So I took on an obligation to try and raise about $1,500 for the station. I got $100 today from somebody. The tape cassettes went out when I wasn't on the air. They go out as usual to subscribers to other stations. But people who get this program and hear it every week and who enjoy it, I would like to ask you in some way, if any of you can, to think in terms of contributing towards the station. They need it badly, and I've committed myself to raise $1,500 towards that goal. I've got $100 today, and I'm going to work for that because they need equipment in the office, and they need a lot of things to keep this station going, and it's very important. So whatever you feel like doing, and for the holidays or whatever, give one less gift and send it to KAZUFM because there's a wide range of programs, and we really appreciate anything you want to give to the station. Now, 1 year ago, this evening, on the anniversary of Kennedy's assassination, was November 22nd, 1981, broadcast number 520. I was talking about Otto von Bolschwing and the article that Pete Carey did in the San Jose Mercury November the 18th of last year, and the importance of Otto von Bolschwing. And even though he passed away this year, his relationship to ITT, to Ford Motor Company, to the American espionage systems, to Stanford Technology, to Helene von Damm, who makes the appointments in the White House, his relationship to Palestine, he became Israel and the Haganah, and probably one of the most important men of American history. And I was very excited on the anniversary of Kennedy's death that this man surfaced even in a small way, because the Reinhard Gehlen agents in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and in New Orleans worked with Lee and Marina Oswald, and he was the heir to Adolf Hitler's Gehlen operation in the United States, so had to be the superior and have tentacles overseas and in the United States, these various people. That was 1 year ago this week, tonight, and yesterday in the San Francisco Chronicle, there is a very large article on Otto von Bolschwing by his son, and I'm going to share that with you. It's 1 year later, and there's some very revealing things that he's saying. Just a few items before I get into some important material, which I call the circle, putting together, if you can imagine, and get your pencil while I'm on the air, or you can write to me for a bibliography of the program at Box 22511, Carmel 93922. I have various subjects, favorite subjects that I have deemed to be most important, and of course they would someday link together. One of them is that cast of characters, particularly at 20th Century Fox, because it involves Gerald Ford, and he was a member of the Warren Commission, one of the most important members for the CIA, hiding the Nazi organized crime connections. The other subject, my favorite subject, is, of course, Otto von Bolschwing and his links to everywhere from Richard Nixon to it's a whole list of subjects that I've sent out on the von Bolschwing tapes and sheets on this particular character. And another area that has fascinated me the past few years is Michael Sindona and the Vatican connection, the Vatican banks, and the links of the Vatican investments to American politics, to organized crime, and to the international fascist network started before World War II and continuous today. And then to top it off this week, I'm going to try in a way that isn't too complicated to put John DeLorean into this network. Now, John DeLorean's attorney is Joseph Ball, who was the attorney for the Warren Commission. And John DeLorean is on the board of Chris Kraft, which owns 20% of 20th Century Fox. It's a tangled web, and you won't remember all of the names, but you'll get a pretty good idea of this circle. So sometime during this program, get your pencil, and if you want to take some notes, it would be great. Now, a few items I want to get over before I get to those subjects and the interconnections of them. I did mention on the air last week or the week before the trial in San Antonio, Texas, of Joseph Chagra and Jimmy Chagra, and the Mr. Harrelson, Harrelson, who's being charged with the murder of the Judge John Wood. The quotation that I had about the John Kennedy assassination came in the Dallas Times-Herald, an article by Stuart Lytle, Dallas Times-Herald, November the 2nd, 1982. And in that newspaper item, it says, in the testimony this morning, that was in first week of November this month, in the testimony this morning, Joe Chagra, the attorney, said that Mr. Harrelson, he's the defendant in the case of shooting Judge John Wood, bragged to him that he had killed President John Kennedy in 1963. He said that Harrelson drew a map of the area where Kennedy was shot in downtown Dallas and told Chagra where he hid to shoot Kennedy. In his testimony, Chagra did not specify where Harrelson claimed he was hiding. Now, they didn't ask him in the attack of shooting U.S. District Judge John Wood, Jr., where Harrelson was hiding. Well, why didn't the major newspapers pick this up? This was a story carried on some wire services, Dallas Times-Herald, because I had mentioned a long time ago in relationship to Edwin Wilson, a defendant in Maryland this last week who has 3 more trials going, that Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple worked with the China Lake emptying of American weapons to send overseas to Gaddafi. They worked with Harrelson and Chagra. That was their Las Vegas connection to Nugan Bank. And Theodore Shackley, who was in charge of covert operations for the CIA, and Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple would then be located as a role in the Kennedy assassination, which I know they all had a part of, particularly knowing their operations before and after. Theodore Shackley brought over to the Bay of Pigs to the anti-Castro Cubans, and Wilson, the paymaster for the anti-Castro Cubans that killed John Kennedy and worked with Frank Sturgis, Frank Fiorino, and so forth. So they have to bypass this because to bring out a question about what do you mean, Harrelson, what are you saying, in the courts of Dallas would open up the can of worms that is trying to cover its bases at the present time every which way. But these assassins are in the news one way or the other, and Harrelson would be and could be telling the truth because the other people linked to the Chagra boys and the Las Vegas connections, and I say the Australian Nugan Bank. Now, I mentioned a cosmetic war going on. It was just beginning when Mary Martin had her near-fatal crash when her friend and associate was killed in that car crash. But now there is a real cosmetic war, if that wasn't enough, in the Defense Department. And the reason I bring this up is Higham von Damm, the woman who worked under Otto von Bolschwing, has made an appointment of Ronald Lauder, Lauder, of Estee Lauder Incorporated, chairman of Estee Lauder International. And she said for the White House, this is in the Washington Post, we want him on the board of the Defense Department. Helene von Damm, the White House personnel director, said He has been in and out of the Defense Department talking to various officials about defense matters. Lauder is the son of Estee Lauder, the cosmetic magnate. And Helene von Damm makes appointments for the Defense Department. That's how important she is, and that's why I keep bringing her up, is that she not only makes appointments for the marshals and the various high cabinet positions of Ronald Reagan and for his administration when he was governor for 8 years, but she chooses people for the Defense Department, and her name is in the Washington Post in conjunction with that particular job. This is November the 10th, 1982. Now, more sinister than that is another article in the Washington Post, November the 9th, 1982, about the very secretive J. Peter Grace. Now, many of you remember going back to broadcast 531, I quoted the San Francisco Chronicle, Reagan's choice linked to war criminal. How Ronald Reagan, again through Helene von Damm, had appointed J. Peter Grace to a special committee, a private sector committee, and that he is directly linked to Otto Ambros, the war criminal who designed Auschwitz, who designed the chemical Zyklon B, who worked for I.G. Farben and our Energy Department, who was tried at the war trials in Nuremberg, and the prosecutors pointed to his work with Farben, his use of slave laborers, Auschwitz concentration camp, locating Auschwitz for the Nazis. Now, J. Peter Grace was appointed by, again, von Damm for Ronald Reagan on a special committee, and now Representative Ford of Michigan, Representative William D. Ford of Michigan, is furious and has subpoenaed the Attorney General, William French Smith, because the committee that he set up in Washington, according to the Washington Post, this is November the 9th, 1982, is a secretive group with 1,000 people set up by W.R. Grace, by J. Peter Grace, chairman of W.R. Grace, and they refused to give the General Accounting Office a list of the 1,000 members of its 35 task forces. They have 35 task forces made up of 1,000 people, and the Washington Post says that they are subverting the Constitution and the Congress, and they're going to have subpoena the Attorney General to get the documents that they are working against the government in not telling who is on the committee. Their studies for the president are privately funded, private citizens that you don't know who. I mean, there could be 99% Gestapo that live here now at the present time. And they are doing reports for Ronald Reagan, for the president, and they have subpoenaed William French Smith to get the documents on the president's private sector survey on cost control. And they've asked them, give us the names of the people that are subverting the Congress and the Constitution and coming out with advice for the President of the United States that they will not do. It's not that anything they're doing is allegedly top government secret. They won't let you know who is advising the president. And these Nazis like Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger and Reinhard Gehlen subverted the Constitution totally, and now they're at the most dangerous hanky-panky in advice to the president. And in order to save cost control, one more warning about this particular Mr. Grace of W.R. Grace and Company, Mr. J. Peter Grace. He's supposed to figure out how to save money. And I want you to listen to this article loud and clear, because I can guarantee you, you will hear it again from me, and I hope you write to members of Congress. This is from the Houston Post, October the 14th, 1982. Bagged coal pipeline project draws praise. A $2 billion to put Colorado coal into plastic bags and dump it hundreds of miles away into water. Mr. Grace has been given a contract to take these plastic bags of coal and draw a pipeline 1,200 miles into the ocean, sponsored by W.R. Grace. Now, I think of the body bags at Jonestown and run by these same people, and the bodies were allowed to rot, and they put them in those black bags that didn't do autopsies at mass graves for the children. You better watch the conveyor belt from Colorado to the ocean, because with this secrecy, with this mentality, the idea is to put coal in desalted water and a project that Mr. Grace himself is meeting with 1,000 secret men on 350 committees that they will not tell us who they are. And William French Smith is tied to this Odessa network, and I hope I have time to give you all the links of him to this. But if not this week, next week. That bag coal pipeline is one of the most dangerous operations. Look for it and watch and write if you want to. It was in the Houston Post, October 14th, 1982. If you send me a self-addressed stamped envelope, I'll send you copies of these articles on the committee of Mr. J. Peter Grace. He is the domestic head of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta that has dual citizenship in Italy and in the United States, and they are turning this country over to the Nazis. And it's been a continuous pattern. I don't want to sound too paranoid every week, but these articles are frightening, and the secrecy of these people is exactly what I expected out of that committee when it was appointed. And getting back to von Bolschwing, Otto von Bolschwing and Higham von DAMM, she passes on these appointments, and that's where the danger is. Now, one quick story. All of you read about the draft case that was thrown out in Los Angeles. The federal judge, an article in the LA Times, scolded the government for turning totally useless papers over when he gave a request for papers. U.S. District Judge Terry J. Hatter, Jr., he referred to the government officials as pulling a Watergate, hiding the tapes he was supposed to get. He says their behavior is not acceptable. He said the court can't tolerate the kind of material they're offering us. And he asked for Mr. Meese, and he wouldn't come, and Mr. Jenner. And they had to throw the case out, the draft case, because the government officials were up to a collusion and hanky-panky. The judge was scolding them. Well, this week the judge survived, but he was in a car wreck. A very small article in the San Francisco Chronicle. Judge in draft case hurt in car wreck. In Los Angeles, the federal judge who freed a draft resistor and dealt a blow to the selective system was injured. Judge Hatter's head broke the windshield of the car. He banged his elbow, his legs. He was in emergency hospital. He's all right. He almost got a Kevin McCullough. If it wasn't a heart attack, it could be a car crash. He survived it, but just within a week after the decision where he was giving it to them loud and clear, he has this strange crash. Now, there's one other item, and then I'll get on to what I consider really some of the most important information that I've been able to put together in a long, long time, and I've worked very hard on it for the last 3 weeks. The San Francisco Chronicle had a story this week, November 17th, Andropov, the best informed man in the world. And I told you, with the head of the KGB now running the Soviet Union, and if all their information is the kind of information I have, we're in a totally different kind of ball game, and it'll be very interesting to see how we keep up with what they know and how we modify our behavior if he is the best informed man of the world. Now, he meets, as I say, eyeball to eyeball with Ronald Reagan. There was an article in the Los Angeles Herald just last week, atomic tiff over Reagan freeze remarks. And this is about the ACLU and various organizations accusing the president of using McCarthyism because he said that foreign agents had a role in the nuclear freeze movement. And various people and investigators asked him for his evidence. Where did you come up with the evidence that this happened? If you said it, prove it to us. And he pulled out the Reader's Digest. And the way to describe our president versus the head of the Soviet Union is a cartoon that Conrad had in the LA Times. It's Ronald Reagan in bed, and he's reading the Reader's Digest, and his hair is standing on end. And underneath it says, Foreign Policy Briefing. Now, I don't know what Reader's Digest costs because I haven't bought it in years, but let's say $1.25 or whatever. We pay our spy agencies $22 billion. The National Security Agency, the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the FBI, the National Security Council, a budget of about $22 billion a year. And when they ask the President of the United States where he gets his information, he gets it from the Reader's Digest. So just do away with the intelligence apparatus if that's what he needs, given the Reader's Digest. Now I'm going on to that web, and it is a web The Odessa, the term that the Nazis used at the end of World War II to set up their network, or the spider. A spider's web has various posts, and the spider weaves around, so you can't hit one piece of that web that's hanging up there if you see it in the light and say, this is what the spider lives in or catches his flies or whatever he does there. A web is put together with various pieces secured at various posts, and then the spider spins around it, so that when you're talking about the spider or the Odessa, you can't simplify. You sometimes can talk about a particular and then sometimes in general. Now, this past week, I'm going on to the Odessa and these other matters and try to give you a framework of where some of the news events fit in. And I might say, and I hope I have time to do it tonight, have you noticed that the Tylenol story went off the news when John DeLorean was arrested? Have you seen anything about the Tylenol killer or the quest? Well, I have made about 12 or 14 interesting links or possible connections to the DeLorean saga, to the IG Farben Tylenol story, and I'll do those for you. But watch how quiet Mr. Tylenol scandal fades away. We'll all buy the product again, and we'll forget who caused it or where the agents are. And they've been suggested, Mr. Lewis with the alias Richardson and Mr. Arnold and a wealthy stockbroker in Chicago, and very interesting bank connections, city locations, and travel connections to the DeLorean story. But the Tylenol faded when DeLorean phased in. Now, Charles Higham was up here on the peninsula this week. He brought a manuscript of his new book. If you have a Christmas, Hanukkah present or birthday to give to somebody, save your money. His book will be out in December or January, his new book. It's called Trading with the Enemy, an expose of Nazi American money plot from 1933 to 1949. It's by Delacorte Press. It's going to be $16. Put it on your list, Trading with the Enemy. Why is this book so important? Because I told them I didn't have a chance to read it. I just saw, it in the hand. It's a manuscript that details corporations such as Standard Oil of New Jersey, the Chase Manhattan Bank, the Texas Company, ITT, Ford Motor Company, and Sterling Products, working with the Nazis from 1933 to 1949, 2 years after the National Security Council and the CIA were formed. From the day Hitler came to power up through into the Cold War, where the von Bolschwings take over, and on through Watergate with the ITT connections and the DeLorean with General Motors. There is a story here that is a very basic story to all of the researchers that want to know the continuous process of funding Adolf Hitler going back from the time of World War I, and how the same people, the same corporations, and Reader's Digest, again, that the president was quoting, very much a part of that story. Trading with the Enemy will be out. I can't tell you more, but you will enjoy that as part of your library to put the pieces together. Now, going from Trading to the Enemy to the book that will be out, there is a new article yesterday in the paper, The Dark Past He Couldn't Escape. And this is an article by the son of Otto von Bolschwing, who has law offices up in the Bay Area and also in Ireland. And he's talking about his father, who was a genuine war hero. And he is telling about his work with the United States Army continuously, and his membership in the Nazi Party, in the SS, his role with displaced persons, and he had shady dealings in the 1933 in espionage business in Palestine, in America, and so forth. Then he tells about his father started with American intelligence. Before the war, he said, von Bolschwing visited William Donovan, the head of the American OSS in New York City in 1939. Now, William Donovan, as soon as the Soviet Revolution took place, went up to visit the White Russians. He was sent up to the Far East into Siberia to meet Admiral Alexander Kolchak, Kolchak. You might have the book Kolchak's Gold and the story of Kolchak. He went up to Vladivostok, and worked with the white Russian community. Then he went with Herbert Hoover, who was over in Europe. The Rockefeller Foundation created the American War Relief Commission that Herbert Hoover was the head of when he was arming the white Russian czarists. And Herbert Hoover made Mr. Donovan the Attorney General of the United States before the OSS. Herbert Hoover was Secretary of Commerce at the time when he appointed J. Edgar Hoover as FBI director, and Mr. Donovan of the OSS, who was working with von Bolschwing. Now, in 1939, von Bolschwing was a financier for the Krupps. And then he's from 33, the whole time he was working for Adolf Hitler, and in Palestine and in the Netherlands and in Romania, working with those organizations, the worst fascist elements. He was in the United States with Donovan, so that places him. The OSS was formed in 1942. It places him in 1939 with William Donovan, and Donovan is up with the white Russian czars. Donovan worked with Herbert Hoover going back to this time period where Herbert Hoover was setting the stage for World War II and then World War III on the pain of World War I. Now, this story about von Bolschwing in the article this week has some very interesting facts that I'll go into later. And he says in 1969, von Bolschwing became a business consultant for a Sacramento technological firm, TCI. That was the company that his father worked for. And this article came out in the paper yesterday, and for the past 2-3 weeks, I've been photocopying the corporate papers from the Security Exchange Commission on TCI. And that corporation was formed by a group of people at New York, Beverly Hills, Washington, and San Francisco that I'm going to get into that directly links to John DeLorean, 20th Century Fox, the Vatican banks, and von Bolschwing, and using Democratic offices to set up the spy work for the Nazis. Now, this story, there are many details or quotations in this article I'll get to later on that subject. But I'm going now to the John DeLorean story, which I hope in this half hour will make a cycle to von Bolschwing and TCI. It makes it in my mind, and I want to share it with you. We'll take a break in about 1 minute because I was about 2 minutes late here in getting the tape started, and then we'll continue on this story. There was an article in the New York Times on about the DeLorean family. It glamorized them. DeLorean, A Life of Extravagance. November the 9th, 1982, page A20, if you want to look it up. And it tells about DeLorean. I'm going to his New York connections right now, not the California. He was in California, and that's another part of his life. But in New York, he is close to Herbert J. Siegel, chairman of Chris Craft Industries, David Mahoney, chairman of Norton Simon, Roger Penske, a millionaire race car driver, Pete Rozelle, the National Football League, Robert Fairchild, a wine importer, the vice president, Sheldon Tannen of 21 Club, Don Hewitt of CBS 60 Minutes. Mr. Siegel put Mr. DeLorean on the board of Chris Craft, and he's listed there as a board director as a part of the Chris Craft Corporation. John DeLorean is part of the Chris Craft Corporation. I'll take a 1-minute break now, and then we'll get back to John DeLorean, Chris Craft, and Mr. Siegel. Going back now to broadcast number 572, November 22nd, 1982. In the New York Times, it talks about the social life of Mr. DeLorean and the people that he works with on the board and sees regularly. And I will do many programs on that on Johnny Carson. They describe him as a devout Catholic, but he's divorced 2 wives. He's on his 3rd, so I can't figure that out. And they also have, in addition to his social life, they explain that he was never in Ireland. A person that worked for him in the Irish factory said in that article, I don't think he was here more than a half a dozen times. He never knew him, nor did anybody know him, that he stayed in London when he had the car factory in Belfast, Ireland. He flew in from London and back and forth. He didn't stay there. They called it the Irish Caper because he had nothing to do with Ireland, really. The factory was set up by the British and Irish government, but he was never in Ireland, but he was with Mr. Siegel on the board. Now, I remembered when Mrs. DeLorean flew out to California, she had Mr. Siegel with her, the head of Chris Kraft organization. So I got out of my files, Los Angeles Times, February 27th, 1981, Chris Kraft's Hidden Charms, 23% ownership in Fox Film. Now, keep in mind, on the board is William Rogers, who was Secretary of State and involved with the Bahamas Mafia, drug connections, and with the Shah of Iran and the whole. He was a courier and a benefactor of Richard Nixon's career for 25 years. William Rogers on the board of 20th Century Fox, Grace Kelly of Monaco, and then there's John DeLorean, who has Chris Kraft has 20% ownership, 23%. They put $140 million into 20th Century Fox when Marvin Davis had it, and they put a big hunk of their own investment, over 45% of their own investment, into the Fox studio out here. And then on the board put Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission, the anniversary of Kennedy. We'll keep reminding you of that. And Joseph Ball, the attorney of the Warren Commission, representing DeLorean, and Henry Kissinger, the protege of Fritz Kramer and co-partner of Helene von Damm. I repeat this over and over because that cast of characters is amazing. Okay, Chris Kraft not only is part owner, 20%, and that's Del Monte Properties, Pebble Beach, but they're the largest maker of DDT. Many of you do not know that. And the chemical and the DDT and the possibility of the IG Farben connections there is horrendous. The largest maker of DDT is Chris Kraft. So next time you go out in your boat, think that over. So John DeLorean is on the board of Chris Kraft. His wife flies out with him to California. One of their chemical company, incidentally, is called Montrose Chemical. If you want to look it up, one half owned by the Chris Kraft, and as I say, the large makers of DDT. So she flies out to California. Her husband is arrested, and she's on the arm of Mr. Siegel. Her husband is on the board. I looked up in Who's Who in America. First got a listener to World Watchers, got me Standard & Poor's. We keep these books at the home so we don't have to run to the library. I got Chris Kraft in Standard & Poor's and 1980 version, and it describes her office in New York City, and Primary Bank, Philadelphia, National Bank in Philadelphia. There's lots of activity. I won't do the Philadelphia connections tonight. Primary law firm, Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, Garrison in New York. That's their primary law firm. And on the board is John DeLorean and Mr. Roselle and David Mahoney of the huge, that's the Hunt Food, the Norton Simon. And then there's other members of the directors that I will do for you on another evening. The board of directors that are companions of John DeLorean. Now, the primary attorney law firm is Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, Garrison. Okay. Now, I went to Who's Who in America to look up Mr. Simon Hirsch Rifkin, the attorney. And in there it describes his degree at law at Columbia University and his partnership in law firms in New York and in Washington. And he was a partner of Stevenson, Rifkin, Wirtz in Chicago, and also Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison, that same firm that represents Chris Kraft and 20% of 20th Century Fox. Rifkin is the attorney for Chris Kraft primary. He also represents Revlon, that makeup, and Sterling National Bank and Trust Company. And that is the connection to Continental Illinois, to Michael Sindona, to David Kennedy, the former Secretary of the Treasury under Richard Nixon, and he's a high vice president of the Mormon Church. You see, there's Jews, there's Mormons, and there's Vatican, and there's Mafia. It isn't. This Odessa network isn't homogenized, I guess the word I want to use it, isn't a single group. There are a lot of people, just as there were Jews that funded Hitler. It says in charge, Director, Sterling National Bank and Trust Company. Now, I have the names of the other members of Chris Kraft, and I'll go through those with you at another time. But when you look up the Sterling National Bank, and I looked for that bank, I got out of my articles from the one from the Wall Street Journal dated February the 1st, 1980. Italy accuses the ex-chief of the Treasury, that's Richard Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury, and the Sterling Bancorp, Bancorp, of bank fraud. This is Wall Street Journal. The Italian government accused former U.S. Treasury Secretary David Kennedy, Sterling Bancorp, and others of conspiring with financier Michael Sindona to defraud an Italian bank where Sindona owned and controlled $27 million. Sindona was responsible for the breaking of the Franklin National Bank, a $45 million scandal in New York City of Americans. He's been charged in Italy, along with Mr. Kennedy, of murdering primary witnesses to the case, and Roberta Calvi, who took over Sindona's connections when Sindona was arrested, was the man who was hung in June. He was in London. It was in June this year. He was found June the 18th. Now, in the article in Wall Street Journal, it said Mr. Kennedy couldn't be reached, of course, and it refers to the collapse of the National Bank, Franklin. But Theodore Silbert, chairman of Sterling Bancorp in New York, said he hadn't seen the lawsuit, but that he would look into it. Now, the important thing is that David Kennedy, who's mentioned in this case, was the head, or still could be, was the head of the Continental Illinois Bank. That funded 20th Century Fox. It's the one Cardinal Cody used. It's where the extortion notes for $1 million to go down to the Cayman Islands that the Lewises used. It was used with Michael Sindona, and it funded the GOP and Richard Nixon and, of course, Ronald Reagan. The Continental Bank of Illinois is a very important bank in this espionage network, and they're in trouble now because they have put aside like $2 billion in loans they can't account for, like the Vatican Bank. But this bank also gave $5 to $7 million to John DeLorean for investments in Utah. And that's been very secret, except for Jeff Gerst's article in the New York Times on the DeLorean Utah connections, because he used this Continental Bank. This bank was used by Sindona. The Chris Kraft Company, of which he's on the board, has an attorney who is involved with this bank, and they identify this bank, Theodore Silbert, as the head of it. So then I looked in Who's Who of America under Theodore Silbert, and the Sterling Bancorp is the same as the Sterling National Bank and Trust Company in New York. And Mr. Theodore Silbert, who is out in California in Lott, he's at Hillcrest Country Club along with these other characters, and the Racket Club in Palm Springs, and a trustee of Brandeis. Didn't Mr. Blakey from the House Select Committee on Assassination come to us from Brandeis, who covered up the mob and Nazi connections? I'll do biographies of these people, but the point is that when DeLorean was arrested and flew out with Mr. Siegel, he was on the board of that company. That board has an attorney who has corporations around. He represents banks and different interests and corporations in the United States, and it is very important to this entire story network at a different level. Now, before the DeLorean work, before I looked up in Who's Who, the Chris Kraft, or the people on the board of Chris Kraft, or the attorneys, or the banks, I had spent 2 weeks with Pete Carey's information that he got from Sacramento. It came from the Security Exchange Commission on the origin of Otto von Bolschwing's corporation that his son refers to in the newspaper this week. The corporation is called Computer Time Sharing Corporation, that later became TCI. There are two corporations here, and one set up the other. It was like giving it its respectability. This one corporation was set up with 4 law offices, and it was basically founded Computer Time Sharing Corporation. Now, this may get technical if you don't listen carefully. The Security Exchange Commission documents, registered December 30th, 1968, have Computer Time-Sharing Corporation, 525 University Avenue, Palo Alto, California. Now, this is important because all these people tap into Stanford Research, and Stanford Research was behind the SLA, the Patty Hearst saga, the Jonestown, Tim Stone, the London banks, the Canada banks. CTC had these offices. The address for them was in Palo Alto at Stanford University, and you know the role and the influence of Palo Alto on the Reagan administration and advisors, and the Hoover Institute, which is the nest of documentation of various Nazis from World War, the end of the Russian Revolution up to the present day. Now, the offices they set up, one was William Conklin, the secretary, in Palo Alto. The second office was Noble McCartney in Washington, D.C. The next office was Bruce Allen Mann from Pillsbury, Madison, and Sutro in San Francisco. That's Standard Oil of California. And their fourth office was James Lockwood, Rifkin, and Sterling, the same Rifkin who represents Chris Kraft, their primary attorney, and Chris Kraft with DeLorean buys out of Marvin Davis's share 20% of the Fox with that cast of characters. Keep in mind the characters, and I'll do more detailed biographies if you need them. Their offices, 9300 Wilshire Boulevard, Beverly Hills, California. Now, the corporation papers go into great detail on Computer Time-Sharing Corporation with these four offices, New York, Washington, Beverly Hills, and Palo Alto. But Mr. Rifkin was the attorney for that corporation, CTC, as well as Chris Kraft. So he had two roles, and they merged later. Now, in 1968, that CTC was set up, but by 1969, they changed the name. The name was changed, but it was, you know, if you have a daughter and she gets married, it's just a change of name. It's a part of the family, and this corporation changed its name to TCI, Trans Computer Investment. It actually is Trans International Computer Investment. They call it TCI. And in the article on Otto von Bolschwing, and I could copy those if you wanted, in the paper yesterday and the earlier work I did, TCI, Trans Computer Investment, as of October the 1st, 1969, changed its name, but it's the same cast of characters, and it began with the Beverly Hills offices of Rifkin and Sterling down there in Beverly Hills, as well as Washington, San Francisco, and Palo Alto. Well, they set up a corporation of management, and then they put various people on the board. One of them, who was the head of it, and remember, the godfathers of it were those offices in Beverly Hills, Washington, Palo Alto, and San Francisco. One man on it, the president and chairman to set it off, was O.S. Williams Jr., Oswald Williams. His occupation, he was chairman of the board of TCI. He was called the vice president, the director, and for many, many weeks, I'll do a background on him and his link to setting it up, to going with two Germans to Las Vegas, Nevada, going down to the Bahamas banks where a man has a hotel room with no noticeable ID, setting up corporations where money for Europe would be put into those banks down in the Bahamas. And that's where I think the Vatican money is missing, because they directly link, and DeLorean, a clue was his going to St. Patrick's every day that he's in New York, according to the press, and taking the children there every week with Cardinal Cook, the national director of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Now, under Oswald Williams, who does the Bahamas trip and opens up the funneling for European money to be poured into this company, is Emmanuel Tsenakis. I'll spell it. You would never guess it. F-T-H-E-N-A-K-I-S, the director from Los Altos, California. His current occupation in aerospace was the optical division of ITT, the same people that Charles Higham is writing about in Trading in the Enemy. He worked for Philco Ford Corporation, director of space vehicle operations, going back to ITT, the same corporations, only with Otto von Bolschwing, is to become, he's the man behind the scenes up in the Palo Alto area. He's in the United States 5 years, gets his citizenship in 1969, the year that the corporation changes. Otto von Bolschwing is an American citizen and starts traveling with a judge from the Bay Area over to Europe to make very important connections of the Odessa. In the corporation is Larry F. Vance, executive vice president. He is vice president of TCI. He was with Computer Timeshare Corporation, the CTC, when it was set up 1968 and 69. And by 1964 to 68, he was with another corporation similar to the computer work. But I have reasons to believe that this was a worldwide espionage system. Their method of operation, according to the corporate papers, is to acquire small existing European companies in related areas, and they're Argentina, Ireland, South America, Madrid, and Spain, Italy, utilize as much as possible European hardware, software, and personnel talent, utilize European capital so that profits remain in Europe. That is on the direction of what they're supposed to do, but they're setting up banks to put the money into the Bahamas. Now, Mr. Williams was chairman. Mr. Vance was vice president. Senencas was a nephew of Aristotle Onassis, with Greek links to the Greek military junta, and his co-workers were from Litton Industry, and Litton Industry in 1967 had pulled that military coup that they were able to overthrow, but these guys go way back. There's a Dr. Otto Berg from NASA, and I'm going to do in time Dr. Dean Brown from Stanford Research Institute, Dr. Ernesto Davida, D-E-V-I-D-A, from Sao Paulo, Brazil, Mr. Fraser McNo, M.C., capital K-N-O, from Getty Oil in Rome, Italy, Mr. Gordon Getty, the son of John Paul Getty. Again, the Getty name, the Ford, the ITT, go back to the work of Charles Higham and that book, When You See It, and their connections to multinational corporations overseas and in the United States. This particular operation, once it was set up, the advisor on the surface was Otto von Bolschwing, and in the corporate papers, they were sued. The TCI, it refers as defendants, Mr. Senencas and Otto Berg and Dean Brown and John Paul Getty Jr. and Leroy Hirsch and Walter Leverton. Harold Lamons, these are well-known names in California, and Otto von Bolschwing and Emmanuel Senencas and so forth. So these, Otto von Bolschwing set this up, but took the position as an advisor and eventually became vice president of the group. The cast of characters, again, von Bolschwing, at the time the corporation was in full swing, became the vice president of business affairs and secretary of the organization and traveled around the world. And the former head of Fairchild and ITT, Mr. Senencas, was the acting president. John Paul Getty Jr. was director of Getty Oil Company. Now, the important, and I don't want to get you too tangled on the biographies of these people and the corporate role that they played in Ford Motor Company and ITT and Mr. Getty's connections to this network of espionage. There are many good books on the ITT, on the OSS. The important thing that I want to mention and repeat is that when John DeLorean was arrested, he came out with Mr. Siegel of Chris-Craft. Chris-Craft is the world's largest manufacturer of DDT. And incidentally, Otto von Bolschwing traveled under the patronage, besides the Getty family and the Cabots of Boston, he traveled under Elmer Bobst and Warner Lambert Chemical. And Elmer Bobst with William Donovan of the OSS, the same man who was meeting and working with Otto von Bolschwing while he was working with Adolf Hitler and the Krupp organization. Donovan was the first person that Elmer Bobst put on the American Cancer Society. In the book, the biography of Elmer Bobst, when the lay people, the non-medical, took over the American Cancer Society, he put Mr. William Donovan, who has worked with Herbert Hoover, with Otto von Bolschwing, and with this network of spies and agents. Now, on the one end, a corporation is making DDT. On the other hand, they're trying to, in quotes, find the cause of cancer. There has never been more cancer. There's never been more profits for hospitals, for doctors, for drug companies, for inducing cancer, for chemicals, for lying about what gives cancer, so that these corporate structures have the capacity to deliver it on your vegetables, your produce through the DDT and the spraying and occupational hazards. Then they have the monopoly of the, in quotes, quoting it, and they have the technology of giving it to you, so that if somebody is controversial, like Martha Mitchell, she gets a needle in her behind and gets a fatal cancer. So that you have this problem of causing cancer and curing it and being in the hands of the same people. Now, DeLorean comes out here, and having 20%, being on the board and having 20% of 20th Century Fox is very important, because the highest level of the military echelon, Madame Chenault, I have a picture here I brought in of Claire, of her husband, Mr. Claire Chenault, with William Donovan. Donovan worked closely with Chenault. Chenault's Flying Tiger was notorious for narcotics coming and flying in from Asia, and the drugging of China with Chiang Kai-shek and bringing it in to this country after World War II, and Air America, and the Flying Tigers, of course, escalating after the Vietnam War. William Donovan worked with von Bolschwing. He worked with the highest echelon of the dope dealers. He worked with the Nazis before and during and after the war, as Charles Higham goes into the fact in his book. Now, when you get a Henry Kissinger, the protege of Fritz Kramer, and we don't smoke out Fritz Kramer and can't get anything about him, how he came to this country, and I'm sure that identical to von Bolschwing, it was the same methods and the same secrets. Incidentally, von Bolschwing's son had a quotation in the paper that was really hilarious yesterday. He said, "The reason the Justice Department went after my father was because he was the big fish." Now, I'm sure that Mr. Gus von Bolschwing does not hear my programs. I'm sure of that. But I have referred to finding von Bolschwing as the big fish. And why is he so important? He's important because he worked with Helene von Damm. She was the translator for TCI. She invested money into it, into that corporation. And who set it up? Mr. Rifkin, the attorney for these corporations, who is working with these people. There were honorary Jews in Germany that were allowed to work. Their bank structures were set up. Hitler had them honorary Aryans. And there's a network of Jewish law offices and people working with the banks of the Vatican, working with the mafia, working with the Mormons, even though the Mormon Church has the list of all those Jewish families going back hundreds of years, and the archives have them also of people who are radicals or whose politics are a little offbeat. These files are kept. These Jews don't seem to be concerned with that at all. They seem to think that they will escape the consequences of this, so that Mr. Silbert and these various attorneys can work in that situation. But I think the attorney for the Chris Kraft, being the attorney that set up the corporation that allowed Helene von Damm and von Bolschwing and Mr. Senakis and the ITT and the Ford Motor Company to then form Stanford Research. And that's where Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple come in, because they worked through Stanford Research. And what they did was they allowed these 4 offices in Beverly Hills, New York, Washington, San Francisco to set up a company. Then that company, a year later, changed its name thanks to the network. See, they couldn't have done it alone. Mr. Oswald Williams, he's the courier between the Bahamas and carries the bag money down to the banks as a gesture. He made those trips down there to open these accounts from Las Vegas. He can't do it alone. So the biggies set up the 4 offices. The 4 law offices are set up. Ozzie Williams becomes the president. Then the multinational computer Nazi network of the Gettys, of ITT, of Philco Ford come on the board, and then put von Bolschwing on as vice president, even though he was instrumental in helping it get organized and set up. So that there is a network here. And getting back to Grace Kelly and 20th Century Fox, or the deaths around 20th Century Fox, I'm going to do a story for the National Examiner a few weeks on the 12 or 14 deaths that I believe are related to this story just in regards to the 20th Century Fox. Incidentally, not tomorrow, but a week from Tuesday, I did another article for the National Examiner with Cliff Leindecker on the subject we had on the air last week on the Nazis in Oroville, California, and Charles Manson, and the plan of the law enforcement to allow Manson to get out the murder of Joe Hoover up there. That article will be under Cliff Leindecker's name, but it's my material like I did the one on Grace Kelly and the Vatican. Now, next week, I'm going into the parallels of the DeLorean story with the heroin coming from Thailand and Mr. Arnold having airplane ticket to Thailand, the extortion note through that Continental Bank in Illinois, the Continental Bank funding DeLorean in Utah. It seems that there may be a series of connections that should be investigated. And of course, Mr. Rifkin ties in to William French Smith, the Attorney General. There's a direct connection of Mr. Rifkin to the Attorney General William French Smith. And that's why it's so important to smoke them out on that J. Peter Grace connection in Washington, and what the body bags are that go from Colorado, again, Colorado's in the news so much, out to the ocean, 1,200 miles, and out in a body bag. Is it going to be coal or is it going to be us? These people, their names reappear over and over again. If you study 20th Century Fox, you end up with DeLorean. If you study DeLorean, it leads to von Bolschwing. I hope it isn't too complicated for you. This was a little technical, but it's very important to know that pieces of a much bigger puzzle are coming together in the news. If you work hard enough, you can find them. They're there, and they fit perfectly. And hopefully we can get enough letters out and tapes out to people to alert them of what to look for and to help us further investigate these cases, because they should be ongoing for all time. Now, this is Mae Brussell. This is KAZU-FM. We're going to close off now. It's a few minutes late, but we don't want to get the station off on that regard. So I'll sign off now. Have a nice Thanksgiving, those of you who hear this live, and for the others, have a nice Christmas. And I'll be back with you next week. Take it easy. Again, I'm responsible for everything on this program and not the station.